Okay, thank you. Welcome back to the People's Kitchen Counter Mobilization, taking back our food system. As we work out a couple technical issues, we again thank the People's Forum for hosting us here today in New York City. We're going to transition now to our second panel, and we're going to start this session with a video from our land defender allies in Brazil, who have in the past years have joined us in the United States to work with peasant and family farming communities in the United States. And so we'll have a quick message and video to be played to introduce and set up our conversation on our panels.
Situações, problemas sociais e ambientais por causa dos investimentos que vão dos Estados Unidos para o Brasil, para essas empresas. Essa quantidade de terras que está sendo comprada mostra isso, comprova essa questão, né? Que apenas interesse no lucro para comprar terras, e são terras que a gente chama terras roubadas, né? Terras griladas. Os trabalhadores não têm um recurso, não têm dinheiro para poder pagar advogados, para chegar até a capital a tempo hábil para resolver situações. Então termina sendo presas fáceis. Eu vejo de cara duas severidades. A primeira delas é a perca das terras das pessoas para espaço desses investimentos que chegam. Uma outra similaridade que eu vejo entre o Piauí e Mississippi é a forma de resistência que as pessoas buscam. Eles se organizam, né, ou em cooperativas ou em coletivos, para resistir, para dizer que são parte da história, para dizer que pertence àquele local. Para mim é triste, é preocupante, né, de ver o tanto que é a ganância do homem. É garantir futuro destruindo outros futuros. A tendência é se avançar, se nada for feito. Esses investimentos de compra de terras lá no Piauí, bem como aqui também, tem que ser colocado um ponto final. O remédio é a unidade. A ação coletiva pode ajudar a todos nós chegar lá. Você pode conversar com seus governos. Você pode fazer muitas coisas. Só não fique quieto, porque você só não fique parado achando que tudo está bem.
So again, welcome everyone to our second panel today, which is titled Defending Land Rights for Food Sovereignty in the Americas and Beyond. My name is Jordan Treakle. I am the National Programs and Policy Coordinator for the National Family Farm Coalition. NFFC is an alliance of 30 grassroots and farmer-led organizations across the United States, working on behalf of the livelihoods of family-scale farmers, ranchers, fisher folk, and peasants. And I currently lead the organization's engagement with the United Nations and represent NFFC within our allied networks at the international level, including La Via Campesina and the CSM liaison group opposing the UN Food System Summit. I'd like to thank Tristan and Maria Louisa for joining our panel today. I'm going to read some quick bios from them as we start this panel. Maria Luisa Mendoza has a PhD in human geography from the University of Sao Paulo and is a visiting scholar at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at CUNY Graduate Center. She's the co-director of Rede Social de Justiça y Direitos Humanos, or the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil, and editor of the book Human Rights in Brazil, published annually since 2000. Her research includes history and political economy of agriculture, food, land, and water systems, and geopolitical processes of resistance by rural social movements in Brazil and internationally. We also have Tristan Quinn-Thibodeau, who is the national campaigner at ActionAid USA. He works with grassroots organizations and allies through national networks and coalitions to build support for food, agriculture, climate, and land policies that work for communities and the planet. He also works to connect grassroots organizations in the US to international social movements and bring frontline leaders into global policy spaces, particularly around the human right to food. He has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Maine and a Master of Arts in Philosophy from the New School for Social Research. So welcome, Maria Luisa and Tristan. So today we're going to talk about land rights as a cornerstone issue for food sovereignty, agroecology, and human rights. And we're going to be highlighting an international campaign that our three organizations featured here today co-founded with a number of other allies, of which you can see on this slide, more than a decade ago to monitor and oppose land grabbing in the Americas. And we want to bring this topic to this event for a few reasons. An early critique from civil society and social movements against the UN's Food System Summit was its lack of emphasis on the centrality of human rights frameworks generally, and land rights in particular. As the UN Food System Summit attempts to co-opt established UN institutions like the specialized agencies on food and agriculture issues, the land rights agendas in these agencies, which have made some important progress over the past decade, will be further threatened. Secondly, in North America, the conventional debates about land rights and land grabbing have focused on these trends in the global South and Africa in particular. And I've heard this message directly from Eddie Mukumbi and Anne Maina earlier today. And those of us working in North America certainly stand in strong solidarity with our African allies in it condemning and opposing these neo-colonial actions by Western corporations, governments, and powerful actors. But it's critical that we recognize how much of this land grabbing and how this land grabbing in the global South is being financed, as well as recognize that land grabbing takes place in North America too, consistently targeting, in particular, people of color. Let's just remember some recent examples from Standing Rock in the United States, the daily marginalization of customary land tenure rights or heirs property of African American farmers in the US, and the history of mountaintop removal for coal extraction across the Appalachian territories in the US. But I believe the public is starting to take notice. Bill Gates is one of the largest private agricultural landowners in the US now, and TIAA, a US corporate pension fund manager, is not only the largest institutional owner of farmland in the US, but also the world. So this topic is finally emerging into the realm of public discourse in North America, and it's critical that we link the land grabbing stories and struggles beyond the North American region to the other regions where we're hearing from allies today so that we can see the whole picture. Finally, we'll go into this more in the panel, but the false solutions to the climate crisis, such as carbon markets, are increasingly closely linked to land governance issues. Land investments, which some years ago may have just been an economic risk management strategy, now are being seen as an opportunity to grab public green investments as new potential revenue streams by these corporate actors. And the emerging focus of the UN Food Systems Summit on innovation and digitalization risk pouring gasoline on this fire. So I'm going to turn it now over to Maria Louisa to talk about the processes of land speculation and how our campaign kicked off more than a decade ago. So Maria Louisa, the floor is yours. You have 15 or 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. Please remember to mute any notification sounds on your computer or phone, and please speak slowly for the interpretation. Thank you. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Very happy to be here to participate in this conversation. We started in my organization to look into this process of speculation with farmland back around 2010, after the economic crisis, the global economic crisis of 2008, and after the collapse of the housing market in the US. We identified that financial corporations started to target farmland as a new economic financial asset. And the way we found that out was because we were looking into the joint venture of a company called Cosan, which is the largest producer of sugarcane in Brazil, and the oil corporations, the Dutch oil corporation Shell. They did a joint venture and formed the largest producer of ethanol in Brazil. So what was happening at that time was that we were denouncing the expansion of sugarcane monocropping for the production of ethanol, showing that an extensive monocropping could not be sustainable. So that type of production system of agrofuels could not be sustainable and could not be considered green energy. So when we were looking at that and announcing that process, and also looking at how oil corporations were taking over the ethanol market in Brazil and all over the world, we found out that this sugarcane company Cosan had established a new type of subsidiary called Rede. And that was a new type of corporation in Brazil, was a rural real estate corporation dealing with the Brazilian land market, buying land and renting land, not just for sugarcane, but for other crops, mainly agricultural commodities. And then we found out that the main source of funding for that corporation was TIAA, which is a pension fund based in the US, but TIAA also receives funds from other pension funds in Europe and in Canada. So after the global economic crisis of 2008, many agribusiness corporations in Brazil went bankrupt. But because of this new type of funding, financial corporations entering the farmland marketing, that was the reason why agribusiness corporations were able to expand monocropping plantations in Brazil with huge impacts, social and environmental impacts. So GA did not disclose the location of the farms, but even before we started to do grassroots research to look into that, the concrete impact of GA presence in Brazil, we knew two things. We knew that when a large corporation such as GA, a very large pension fund, sets up a fund to buy farmland around the world, not just in Brazil, but in other parts of the world, that already creates pressure on local communities, rural communities, and small farmers, because there is this rush, to buy farmland, and that's the process of speculation that we talk about. The second point is that although the main objective of these corporations is control over land, in order to justify that, there is then an incentive for the expansion of monocropping plantations. And we all know that, no type of extensive monocropping plantation can be sustainable, as they claim, these corporations claim that they put out sustainability reports, but as we also saw in the early panel, these large plantations demand large use of chemical inputs with huge environmental impacts that destroy the soil, destroy water sources, destroy biodiversity, so that over time decrease agricultural productivity. And the main region where they were doing this business, they were targeting the Brazilian Cerrado, which is the most biodiverse savanna in the world. The Cerrado is like an upside down forest. The trees are relatively short, but the roots go on and on and on for many kilometers. So it's also an important source of underground water. And the destruction of the Cerrado changes the rain cycles in the whole hemisphere, from the Amazon region to the south part of the Americas. So there is a change in rain cycles, and of course that creates severe droughts and floods, which is also, of course, related to climate change. We also, it's important to point out that industrial agriculture is a main cause of climate change, because it's based on chemical inputs that are based on fossil fuels. So anyone who is promoting this type of system is actually contributing to climate change. And this is not about the production of food. It's about just the production of a few commodities for export. In the case of Brazil, sugarcane, soy, timber, and beef. So that's why we are also supporting indigenous peoples in Brazil that are calling for a boycott of these 4 commodities. So we then started to do grassroots research and work with local communities in the Brazilian Cerrado to support them in their resistance against land grabbing, because this process creates displacement of rural communities. And all of this was done in public lands. In the Cerrado, there are plateaus, there are flat lands, and that's where the monocropping plantations expanded. And that was a place where local communities used collectively to raise small animals and to collect plants and fruits. And then in the lowlands, in the valleys, are the places where they have their housing and also food production. But because of the huge amount of chemical inputs and also spray of pesticides from airplanes, the pollution from the flat plateaus goes into the lowlands and affect water sources and food production of local communities. So there are several types of social and environmental impacts. So by having information about why that was happening, what are the main players in that process, the communities then started to organize and fight for land rights. We also started to denounce this process of illegal land grabbing, because in Brazil it's very common that local land grabbers partner with foreign corporations. They grab the land, they produce fake land titles, because like I said before, everything used to be public land in this region. And so they fake land titles, they put the land in the markets, and we started to denounce that process. And the communities now are in a very important moment of organizing collectively to demand collective land rights. And we're talking about indigenous communities, peasant communities, and quilombola, which are the rural Afro-Brazilian communities. So we then now, in order to support this local organizing that is happening and the process that is happening now of communities fighting for their collective land rights, we also started to organize an international campaign, an international coalition, and the National Family Farm Coalition and ActionAid and the other organizations that you see in this slide, Friends of the Earth, RAIN, Uprooted and Rising are key members of this coalition. And we also started to look into what are the main players, international players that we can pressure. It's very important to continue putting pressure on international corporations and governments, because again, we saw in the previous panel, for example, the role of the USAID that promoting dumping and the so-called green revolution in other countries, which is a policy that started many decades ago and continues in a moment where we have a dramatic financial crisis and a dramatic health and environmental crisis. So the only way to deal with those crises is by transforming our food systems and creating international solidarity with rural communities that are fighting to implement agroecology and for land rights as well. So we still see these players, these corporations and foreign governments, and also the Brazilian government sells the idea that that is all this empty land in Brazil, which is a neo-colonial perspective. Of course, you can only expand monocropping plantations by destroying the environment or displacing local communities that have been living and producing ecological food systems for many, many generations. And the situation is even more dramatic now because the destruction of biodiversity is also connected with the pandemic, the health crisis, and of course with climate change. So it's very important for us to expand solidarity, and also to send a message that we are not only talking about communities in Brazil, in this isolated area, far away, in rural areas in other countries, but we are talking about a global issue, a process that impacts all of us. And that's why it's very important for us to have this conversation and to create solidarity and to build strategies to resist this process and to transform our food systems and build agroecology in a mass scale. So thank you for this time.
Thank you so much, Maria Luisa, for this important insight and overview of land grabbing trends in Brazil and the international linkages and implications, particularly to North America and the US. I'm going to continue the discussion now with talking a little bit about some of the land access and land grabbing trends and challenges that we see, particularly in the US, but in some degree also in Canada from a regional perspective. But I think it's really important to say at the beginning that the short time that we have today does not give this topic justice. So this is very much an overview that helps, we hope will help draw the parallels between the challenges that Maria Luisa has just emphasized in Brazil, as well as in our home region of North America. I think it's absolutely critical that we recognize the history of colonialism and land theft of Black and Indigenous and people of color communities in North America. This history of colonialism, private property regimes, and racial capitalism are intricately connected. And the corporate ownership of land that we're discussing today, in today's context, is heading in the wrong direction from addressing these issues from the orientation of social justice, human rights, and reparations. When we examine some of the macro level trends in terms of land access in the US, there's a couple key factors that we need to center to the discussion. First off, building on the point that I just made, land grabbing, land loss, and consolidation in the US disproportionately impacts community of color. People of color now own less than 2% of farmland in the US and have lost agricultural land at higher rates than that of the white majority population in this country. A number of factors have contributed to this trend, including violent displacement, political failures to recognize and enforce treaties with indigenous communities, and discrimination in access to resources and services. These challenges are ongoing. This is not a thing of the past. And we need to recognize that as one example of how this issue continues today, 40% of Black owned farmland is under customary or insecure land tenure arrangements in the US, which in some ways mirror some of the insecure land rights challenges that rural communities in Brazil are facing that Maria Luisa has just mentioned. A second important point to touch upon is the reality that many of us know that the farmer demographics in the US is headed towards an aging farming population, which means that more than 400 million acres of farmland, or about 45% of the current agricultural land in the US, is expected to change hands in the coming decade. This is going to have major implications on who will be stewarding the land over the coming years, when at the same time we must be making significant steps to address the climate crisis. When we talk about and talk to young farmers in our network and in our allies networks about the challenges that new and beginning farmers have to entering agriculture, access to land and access to financial resources are consistently raised up as the key barriers to entering farming. We see farmland in the US increasingly being financialized. So in 1970, the average acre of an American acre of farmland cost about $1,000 US dollars, which is adjusted for inflation in today's terms. Over the past 5 decades, up until the present day, that price has more than tripled to over $3,000 per acre. So this means that the median 440 acre farm in the US that would have had a value of $444,000 in 1970 is now worth $1.4 million. This is obviously a major barrier for a new or beginning farmer to be able to find this kind of capital. And this, just the fact of these land prices favors corporate entities, both domestic corporations and corporations from abroad, that can recruit capital and outcompete bidding for land compared to individual farmers. We've seen increasing consolidation from these factors. Farmland investment has doubled in the US over the past decade, and $3.4 billion have been invested just by US pension funds and US farmland. This has contributed, no doubt, to 8% of farms controlling 40% of farmland in the US. So this increasing trend towards farmland consolidation and a disparity between small-scale producers on very small plots and large-scale corporate actors owning very large tracts of land is certainly on the rise. And we have seen this history across the Americas for some time now. It's also really important to recognize the financial pressures that push many small scale farmers and peasants to have to sell their land in order to survive. We have rising production costs in North America, like many other regions. And we see increasing corporate control in all aspects of our food sector, which put significant downward pressure on producers and limit their ability to get fair prices so that they can sustain their livelihoods, steward the land in a responsible way, and feed their communities. So just as a few examples, the median farm income last year in 2020 was negative, with government direct payments accounting for nearly a third of all farm income in the US. We have seen historic levels of farm debt in the last years. And a recent study by the US Department of Agriculture has shown that between 60 and 80% of all small scale farms in the US are operating in a high risk economic position. So there are many folks, because of the lack of fair prices, are very much on an economic precipice or cliff. And whenever we see a natural disaster, if we see a political dispute impacting markets abroad, or we see the overproduction, a spike in production, which drives down prices, these small scale family farmers, because of no fault of their own, are in a very difficult economic position to be able to adapt. All of these factors demonstrate the urgent need for systemic reform of agricultural pricing, particularly for agricultural commodities in the US. And luckily, we have a policy history in this country from about 100 years ago during the New Deal era, where we had parity pricing models. They're called parity pricing, that include things like price floors for producers, coupled with mechanisms to limit overproduction of commodities that we can still draw upon to try to advance a model of agricultural pricing and compensation for agricultural labor that is fair and just. So in my last minutes here, I just want to touch on a couple points of where the corporate actors play in this story in the US. So we see that these corporate actors are investing in a wide cross-section of our food system, including commodity and specialty crops, seafood, processing, agricultural waste management, and distribution. We have heard reports that corporations target farmers in economic distress. There is an informal phrase that is used referred to the 4 Ds, which represent death, disaster, disability, and divorce. And these corporations tend to seek out farmers who are experiencing one of these challenges in their life to approach them to try to buy their land. But we also see these corporate actors engaged in political lobbying around land governance issues. There are many news reports showing that they have been pressuring state governments to water down or throw out anti-corporate farming laws, particularly in the Midwest region of the U.S., that we do know limit some of these corporate investments in land. We also see that these corporations are misusing some international frameworks that did not include in their formulation significant civil society and social movement input. And they reference these international policy frameworks as a kind of legal soft law greenwashing of their activities. And this makes it clear that we have to engage in these international policy forum to prevent this capture of these international frameworks by corporate entities. And then finally, it's important to note that, as we've heard today, corporations that are investing in land and owning land are pushing for a model that reduces the role of public institutions to craft policy in the public interest. And they rather try to hand these processes over to multi-stakeholder platforms where they can more easily exert their influence and push this false solution of voluntary corporate responsibility. So undermining the role and function of public institutions to hold these corporate actors accountable when they impact the environment or human rights. So as I turn it over to Tristan here, I just want to emphasize what we need to oppose these trends in the US and internationally. We need new federal or national regulations to address the 21st century phenomenon of massive capital flows across borders that are being invested in farmland. And we'll talk about how pension funds are a major player in that massive capital flow. But our policies at the national level for addressing this trend are outdated and insufficient. We also must push our public institutions at the local, state, and national level to recognize the policy wins that have been made by civil society and social movements at the international level over the past decade. And this means pushing for implementations of the UN voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure, but more importantly, the groundbreaking UN Declaration on Peasant Rights that was passed in 2018. Certainly also, we must continue to push for the enforcement of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, the rights of Indigenous peoples as well. So with that framing and some perspective on the challenges from the grassroots level and the farmer level in the US, I'll also now turn it over to Tristan to discuss our common campaign and how we're pushing in these directions in a mode of solidarity. And Tristan, the floor is yours for 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Louisa. My name is Tristan Quinn-Thibodeau. I'm the National Campaigner at ActionAid USA, which is a part of the ActionAid International Federation. And I just want to say that we've been involved in this campaign for about the past 5 years and are very honored to be speaking at this event and in conjunction or to raise up alternatives and challenges to this corporate agenda at the UN Food Systems Summit. As Maria Luisa and Jordan have outlined, this new wave of land grabbing is originating with institutions based in North America and in the global north through the financialization of farmland, turning farmland into a financial asset class. But of course, the global north is also a target for these grabs. And this is important because one view of many institutions is that the US and Canada are not targets for agricultural development, or that we don't have problems with our agricultural systems, and therefore we can't have land grabs. And so I think this is an important campaign to address this blind spot. And it also means that we in the global north and in North America have an obligation to take on these issues and to build international solidarity around them. I just want to start my presentation by saying that our campaign in the US, the campaign we're involved in is a multi-continental effort. But within the US, we are dealing with the collision of 3 crises or 3 phenomena, and one of which is a crisis in the financial system, which Maria Luisa emphasized, but it's a particular crisis in the pension system, the retirement system, which has been in the United States underfunded for a long time and reliant on speculative financial activities. And of course, there's the agrarian crisis that in the United States that Jordan emphasized, the loss of family farms, the overexploitation or the continued exploitation of landless farm labor and undocumented in particular, and the increasing price of land, as well as agribusiness's own legitimacy crisis. And then the third crisis is the climate crisis, which is not only threatening agriculture, but is caused by this agribusiness model and the solutions to which they're driving more corporate, trying to promote the corporate agenda. And so the institutions that are most active in this trend in the US, and which we need to address, are the retirement funds, the pension fund managers. And one of the reasons why I'm involved personally and why our organization is involved is because our own retirement fund manager, this company TIAA, which is the biggest and the most prominent, manages our nonprofit retirement savings. And they also manage, over 5 million workers' retirements, primarily in the education sectors, the nonprofit sectors, and the healthcare sectors. And in addition to TIAA's own clients, their farmland fund is a vehicle to recruit investment or recruit financial flows from other public pension systems, both within the United States, the states of New Mexico, Vermont, and New York contribute funds to TIAA's farmland fund, but also provincial public funds, public pension systems in Canada, as well as the Dutch and Swedish national social security systems and pension funds, private pension funds in UK, United Kingdom, and in Germany, as well as others. And this is important because we understand that TIAA, a large financial company, $1 trillion fund based in New York, can approach these public pension funds that are in crisis for the reasons I mentioned earlier and are looking for ways to meet their obligations to their workers. And they can tell them investing in farmland is safe, financially safe, potentially lucrative, sustainable, and very smart. And you'll look very good when you do this. But of course, these pension funds do not have the capacity to verify any of these claims. And so they're left with the impression that this is a good investment for their workers and for their people. And when it comes to individual clients of TIAA, these investments are hidden behind a are hidden. You're not, you have no idea that your money is being put into these kinds of investments in farmland. TIA also owns a lot of timberland, and they have various private equity investments in agribusiness corporations all along the food chain. They own fishing quota up in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. They own thousands of acres of peach farms in South Carolina. They own industrial egg processing and almond processing factories and all kinds of other things. There's a lot of farm labor that's involved on the different farms and companies that they invest in. And there's no way for a client, a worker, to understand that this is where their funds are going. So we formed this coalition in order to do this, to educate the workers about and the clients about where this funds were going, and to even educate the company that this is where maybe you don't even understand the impact that these investments or this speculative activity, because they're not even really investing, they're taking what is happening. So we launched petitions, letters, we've spoken at colleges and universities where many TIA clients work. We've engaged professional academics on these issues to, move through their own institutions of geographers, anthropologists, sociologists, etc., to bring up these issues with their colleagues and to engage with this company who's, the workers give a lot of trust to this financial company to manage their savings to ensure that they have a retirement. And university workers have really championed this and have pushed efforts forward. The faculty and staff at the University of Iowa, the state of Iowa is the heart of agribusiness, advanced a resolution at their university, challenging and calling on TIAA to not do this with their funds, and had overwhelming support. And these kinds of activities have really pushed TIAA and other companies to supposedly to address problems on the ground, but since we're unable to verify, it may just be, fixing their image or trying to adjust their PR. And we have tried to also educate the public pension funds. Some of the organizations in our campaign, especially the European organizations and others in North America and Brazil, organized a fact-finding mission in 2017 to bring human rights experts down to Brazil to visit with communities, to see the impacts of these land deals, and then to go back to the governments, go back to the public pension systems and say, this is the evidence of what is happening. What are you doing to ensure that you are in accordance with your own human rights obligations to ensure that your financial flows are not contributing to human rights abuses abroad? And we've begun to do that with US public pension systems as well. But what we've learned is that particularly in the US, there is not that human rights infrastructure. There is not a legal political infrastructure to regulate and to hold financial companies accountable. So we have had to engage with policymakers to find ways to do this. And there's been, many different, small pieces of legislation which have been proposed, or ideas to tighten up this program or that program or this agency, but nothing that can really do what is needed to do. And it's very challenging in the US context, because the US has not signed or has not ratified the many human rights frameworks or instruments, including the ones which govern the right to food, the right to land, the rights of peasants, and so forth. And it's also a challenge because the financial system does not want to be subject to human rights or to government regulation. They want to regulate themselves. And when it comes to ensuring that their, investments or that their financial activities are good, they want to be the ones who determine that with, as Jordan mentioned, their own principles for social responsibility, which are, written by them or by entities that they provide funding to. They want to use what's called ESG criteria, which stands for economic, social, and governance criteria, to rate investments and then only invest in the best ones. But again, these are not, the criteria is not available to public scrutiny or independent monitoring. So what we've learned, in fact, is that these farmland deals from TIA are rated very highly by ESG screening companies, and that if you were an investor, you would see this and say, well, this is a good idea. And it's not until this campaign brings stories and evidence of what is happening that investors don't know what to do. And suddenly they realize that they've entered into something that they don't know how to get out of, because it's very different to divest from a stock in a fossil fuel company. It's pretty easy. You can do it in a second. It's very hard to divest yourself from a piece of land you just acquired for hundreds of millions of dollars. And what we've also learned is that this rush to grab farmland by financial companies, and also timberland, as mentioned, and other investments, it's not just something like a fad or a trend or something that they now see as a lucrative investment. It's actually quite a bit bigger than that, we're learning, because this climate emergency has also created a legitimacy crisis for the financial industry. They are increasingly being the target for climate divestment campaigners, because the government is not acting. We need to also push on the private sector to get some movement on this crisis, and they're under a lot of pressure to move their money out of the industries, out of the sectors, out of the companies who have created this crisis. But of course, they don't want to do that, because it would jeopardize the status quo. It would jeopardize their own position, and it would create, a new world that they don't want. And instead, they have embraced the idea of achieving net zero, not zero, but net zero, which allows them to offset all the emissions they're responsible for. And what we've seen is that these offsets not only are very dubious in terms of limiting climate change and limiting carbon emissions, but are also extremely land intensive. And we've seen that they're already viewing their farmland, their timberland, as the potential source for these offsets to get them to net zero. And in fact, they've identified, going along with what Louisa said, this colonial idea of empty land. They've said publicly, oh, there's 250 million acres of land in Brazil that needs to be reforested. And presumably, TIA or other actors can just grab that land, reforest it, get carbon offsets. No mention of communities, no mention of any kinds of complications or any kinds of obligations to the people living there. And it's an extremely, extremely problematic view that we're only going to be dealing with more over the next decade as we face this green grab, as Jordan mentioned. And lastly, I just want to say, this is important because everything that we're dealing with this campaign is what the UN Food Systems Summit, in this corporate sort of hijacking of it, is going to be promoting. False solutions around agricultural production, and this idea we need to continue to produce more, but through offsets, expensive corporate control technology, chemicals, artificial intelligence, mechanization, increasing globalization of our food system, as well as the problematic forms of governance, this corporate financial absentee ownership of land, and this idea that we don't need human rights. We can have corporations coming up with principles that they get to determine if they're adhering to somehow address, ethical concerns and make sure we're living well together. It's just not viable. And people that we've engaged in this campaign, regular people, workers, they don't want it either. They want dramatic change. And it's ironic that the institutions we trust to ensure our future as individuals, to ensure the futures of our families, are collectively destroying our future through these kinds of, crazy schemes and crazy deals. So we want everyone to get involved. This campaign can and will become bigger. We need to join forces, and you can join us at www.stoplandgrabs.org. And we have a new sign-on letter that if your organization can join, that would be wonderful. I think the link can go out in the chat if it hasn't already. And there will be other events next week, which we can also share in the chat, as well as a new publication to help drive more grassroots action on these issues and bring them to global policy spaces. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Tristan, for this really important insight into the multifaceted parts of this campaign and the international linkages. The website and sign-on letter that Tristan has mentioned are in the chat, and we will be dropping a link to the registration event that Tristan just mentioned during the upcoming break. I'm going to pass the floor to Maria Louisa for a very quick final word to close us out here today, and then we'll turn it over to Nettie for some wrap-up points for this panel. Maria Louisa, please.
Yes, I would like to point out that this type of speculation with farmland and we don't even like to call it an investment, because it's not about investing, it's about destruction. This also represents a risk for clients of TAA and other pension funds that are dealing with this type of destructive policies, because after a few years, what is happening is that the land is totally destroyed, the water sources are destroyed, biodiversity is destroyed, so the productivity in the land decreases, and it would be difficult for these corporations to sell the land. So that represents a risk for clients. So we need to advocate for public pension funds that are not based on financial markets, because financial markets are the opposite of stability, and workers need stability for the future, for their retirement plans. So this is not a safe asset. Farmland is not so-called a safe asset like they present. And, and also, for example, we all get concerned about the huge fires in the Amazon, for example. What is driving this? It's agribusiness, it's financial capital. So, I think it's not a complicated issue to understand, and we need to amplify the word about this and put more pressure in the UN system and governments and corporations. So, thank you again.
Thank you once again, Maria Louisa and Tristan, for your really valuable perspectives and insight into this trend and drawing these international connections and this clear call for solidarity across different regions and territories. So with that, we're going to close out the panel section and turn it over to our facilitator, Nettie Wiebe, to close out this section of our program. After Nettie's comments, we will transition to a short break, and then we will have our third panel later in the program. So stay with us, and Nettie, please take it away.
Well, thank you all three of you for this deep, rich, and very insightful and very informative dive into what's happening in the financial land grabbing landscape. I won't begin to summarize what you said, but let me just pull out a few things that stood out for me. One is that, as Maria Louisa emphasized, the investor in land and the industrial monocultural agenda there is enormously destructive in many ways, destructive of the communities, destructive of the environment. And it is, and I just want to say this as a footnote, often in the literature, we say that agriculture is contributing to climate change, and we should be careful about it. It's industrial agriculture that is driving climate change. That's the problem. And Maria's examples from Brazil make that perfectly clear. I want to say that Jordan's presentation on what's happening to farmers, aging farm populations, and the sort of corporate actors who are vultures in some ways, targeting those who are most vulnerable, is a very familiar story here in Canada, across North America. And it's not often here in our farm papers and in our policy discussions, it's not often named land grabbing, but it is indeed land grabbing. It's the financialization of land, commodification, and then the corporate investor grabbing of it. And let me just say that Tristan's exploration of how a pension fund and how these investors work, how opaque it is, how free of accountability, how hard it is to even understand, let alone hold them accountable, emphasizes for me how important this whole UN Food Systems Summit corporate grab is, because that's where, in these international fora, that's where that kind of accountability should be exercised, and that's where there should be some transparency. And that is, in fact, why this whole UN Food Systems Summit grabbing global governance is so lethal in on all of these fronts. It is, as Tristan said, just rife with crazy schemes in terms of our own futures and in terms of the future of small-scale farming, ecological health, and our own well-being across the world. So this was a rich and wonderful panel, and I must say, will warrant rewatching on the recording. We'll go now to a short music break, and then after that, we have another panel, Protecting the Sacred, Indigenous Food and Sea Sovereignty. So stay tuned.